chapter, we're going to be looking at business-to-business e-commerce, improving efficiency and reducing costs. So let's go ahead and jump into the module level learning objectives to see what we need to be focusing on for this module. So 1, describe how businesses use the internet to improve purchasing, logistics, support activities, and implementation of outsourcing and offshoring. 2, define electronic data interchange and how it has evolved. 3, analyze supply chain management and the use of internet technologies to improve it. 4, identify how various types of online business marketplaces operate to simplify business-to-business transactions. To begin with, there are far more business-to-business transactions taking place than business-to-consumer transactions. The business-to-business transactions are needed to take place before and sometimes after the business-to-consumer sale. One of the ways that business-to-business transactions take place is through outsourcing and offshoring. So outsourcing is using other organizations to perform specific activities, and this is typically used for manufacturing. A company doesn't necessarily make the item all the way from beginning to end. They will have an item partially made by another company or be getting goods and services from another company. So in the textiles industry, often the manufacturer that is creating a shirt would not begin with planting the cotton to harvest, to turn into yarn or into string, to turn into cloth, to turn into the shirt. So they would be purchasing goods or services, and outsourcing can be having another company do the first parts for you. Outsourcing can also be for things that do not have to do with a goods or service, things like human resources, etc. So offshoring is when you're outsourcing but to an organization in another country. Let's talk about purchasing activities. And we're going to cover some vocabulary that you're going to need to know from this chapter. So the basics of purchasing is that you'll identify and evaluate vendors, select specific products, place orders, resolve any issues after receipt of goods and services. And that's what generally a purchasing department does. Supply chain is the part of the industry value chain preceding a particular strategic business unit. This includes all activities undertaken by every predecessor in the value chain to design, produce, promote, market, deliver, support each individual component of a product or service. Traditionally, the purchasing department buys the components at the lowest prices possible via bidding, and that's kind of their job, is to save money in that area by getting the best prices and the right quality that's needed. Procurement includes all purchasing activities, monitoring all purchase transactions, and managing and developing supplier relationships. This is also called supply chain management. Procurement staff have high product knowledge to identify and evaluate appropriate suppliers. Sourcing is identifying suppliers and determining qualifications, and e-sources is doing that by using the internet. Business purchasing process is more complex than most consumer purchasing process. Spend is the total yearly dollar amount for goods and services purchased in the purchasing department. Managing the spend is an important function and can be a key component to overall profitability. The Institute for Supply Management, ISM, is the main organization for procurement professionals. When it comes to purchasing, there's both direct and indirect materials. Direct materials become a part of the finished good. Direct materials are usually on contract purchasing because you'll continue to need more to continue to make more of the item that you are creating. Spot purchasing is made in loosely organized spot markets if demand exceeds the contract purchasing estimates. Indirect materials are all other materials companies purchase. So that includes factory supplies and replacement parts for machinery. Those items are necessary for the production to continue, but those items do not end up in the finished good that's being produced. Maintenance, repair, and operating is also referred to as MRO. Those supplies are indirect materials and they are purchased on a recurring basis. Standard items or commodities are purchased with price as the main criterion. Purchasing cards or P cards are distributed through companies. Those are credit cards that are tied to the purchasing department, and they allow managers to make multiple small purchases with cost tracking information sent to procurement. Logistic activities are also a very important part of e-commerce business to business. And so classic objective is to provide the right goods in the right quantities at the right place at the right time. All of those things need to line up, and making those line up is called logistics. And so managing materials, supplies, and finished goods. The web and the internet provide increasing number of opportunities to better manage activities. Third-party logistics operates a customer's material movement activities. So business process support activities. Finance and administration, human resources, technology development, all of those are business process support activities. And so human resources, while that it's not a part of the finished good, it's still incredibly important, and that's something that can be outsourced often. Common support activity in training. So most places, if they need to train their employees, there are lots of different options. They can go ahead and choose a company to provide that training for their employees so that they're not having to take managers away from the duties they already need to be performing. Knowledge management is the intentional collection and classification, dissemination of information about a company and its products and processes. There's a figure on page 223 that breaks down some of those categories of business process support activities. And if you take a look over that, that can help you identify what falls into finance and administration, human resources, and technology development. E-government is another part of online business to business. And so that is the use of internet technologies by governments and government agencies. It enhances functions and performed for stakeholders and business-like activity operations. U.S. Government Financial Management Services, FMS, uses pay.gov to handle activity. The Bureau of Public Debt has a site. It's also used in other countries as well. U.S. states and cities usually have sites. It has information about laws and regulations, licenses, jobs, tourism, and more. If you need to renew your license in New Mexico, or your registration, you can go online to do a lot of different activities through the state through their website. So the network model of economic organization in purchasing, or supply webs, that's the next part we're going to get to, is the trend in purchasing, logistics, and support activities is the shift from hierarchical structure towards network structure. What that means is rather than having all these tiers, instead of doing that, you can spread the web out. And by web, I'm not talking about the internet, I'm talking about the web of different organizations that are necessary to complete a business transaction. And so the supply web is replacing the old term supply chain. Often in the supply chain, you think of, you go to this place, this place, this place, this place, and you think of it in a linear fashion. The supply web creates parallel lines that interconnect to form a web or network configuration. So good or service that you need is here, rather than following down the supply chain, it can be going this way, this way, this way, and those can connect as well. The roots of web technology for business-to-business transactions lie in a hierarchical structure and approach to interfirm information technology, electronic data exchange. So electronic data interchange is computer-to-computer business information transfer using a standard format. Businesses exchange info and are trading partners. EDI-compatible firms exchange data in specific standard formats, often transaction data, but it can also include other information related to transactions. Most business-to-business e-commerce adapted from the EDI or based on the EDI principles. Dominant technology for electronic business-to-business transactions is the EDI format. EDI is used for payments. EDI transaction sets to provide instructions to trading partners, banks. It's negotiable instruments, the electronic equivalent of checks. So electronic funds transfers, or EFTs, is the movement of money from one bank account to another bank account. And it's executed using an automated clearinghouse system, which is used by service banks to manage accounts with one another. It's operated by the U.S. Federal Reserve, and there are also private ACHs as well. This brings us to value-added networks. So trading partners can implement the EDI network and EDI translation process in several ways. Each way uses one of the two basic approaches. Direct connection EDI requires each business to operate its own EDI site, on-site EDI translator computer. It's connected directly to each other using leased lines. Few companies use direct EDI connections because dedicated leased lines are expensive. Company may use a value-added network, or a VAN. It receives, stores, and forwards electronic messages containing EDI transaction sets. With indirect connection, EDI trading partners use VAN to retrieve EDI formatted messages. They must install compatible EDI translator software. Trading partners pass messages through the VAN instead of directly connecting computers. An advantage of the VAN is that it provides translation between different transaction sets. And so the VAN performs automatic compliance checking and records message activity in an audit log. EDI on the internet is called Internet EDI, or Web EDI, or Open EDI. All of those terms are interchangeable. So the internet is an open architect network. Electronic Data Interchange Internet Integration, or EDI-INT, is the most common protocol for Internet EDI transaction sets. So now that we've talked about data interchange, let's talk about supply chain management using Internet technologies. Supply chain management is the job of managing integration of company supply management and logistic activities. The ultimate goal is to achieve higher quality, lower cost product at the end of the chain. And so the value creation is in the supply chain. And so you want to be engaging suppliers in cooperative relationships so that you can lead to better, faster, cheaper services for the customer in the end. The company goes beyond its limits and creates new network form among members of the supply chain. The use of technology to improve operational efficiency is supply chain competition. Originally, supply chain value creation was developed as a way to reduce costs, and now it's become the standard, pretty much, is to always be trying to benefit the customer and benefit the business as well by creating the most value in the supply chain. To do this, it requires establishing long-term relationships with a small number of capable Tier 1 suppliers. Tier 1 suppliers develop relationships with Tier 2 suppliers who provide components and raw materials. Tier 3 suppliers provide components and raw materials to Tier 2 suppliers. A key element in value creation in the supply chain is that there's trust among the supply alliances. And so buyers expect annual price reductions, quality improvements from suppliers at each stage. Ideally, each level of supplier can share the benefit of reduced costs and more efficient operations. Key coordination effort is a consistent production strategy adopted by all supply chain participants. Clear communication and quick response are key elements of successful supply chain management. Adaptive supply chains exist when a company uses technology to quickly respond to change in the market and demand and supplier conditions. This leads to higher efficiency, lower costs, and greater profits. Using the internet and web technologies to manage supply chains can yield increases in efficiency and cooperation throughout the entire chain. And so increases in process speed, reduce costs, and coordinate efforts to design increased manufacturing flexibility. This allows the response and change of quantity and nature of ultimate consumer demand. So remember that as a company, even if you can create something very well, you need to be creating the right amount. And so you're going to be using logistics, you're going to be using your supply chain correctly, you're going to be doing the best you can to make sure that you're meeting customer demand. Because if the customers are demanding more, and you can't provide it, that's a loss. If the consumers are demanding more and you're creating too much, you're going to have an overstock, and that's not going to benefit your company, because those are items you can't sell, and again, you'll have a loss. So beyond transactions between companies and data interchange, what are some ways that companies are able to use B2B e-commerce or technologies within their business? One of those is material tracking. So there is a figure 5-12, it's on page 242, and if you look at that, you're going to see a breakdown of different features of different material tracking technologies, and I'll go over them just quickly. Because it's a challenging task to track materials as they move from one company to another or within a company, we use materials tracking technologies. Optical scanners and barcodes track movement of materials and integration with EDI, and now that's very prevalent, that's very common. Manages inventory flow and forecast materials needed across the supply chain. Real-time location systems, RTLS, are barcode tracking systems used by fulfillment centers. Second wave of electronic commerce includes new types of tracking and integration with internet-based materials tracking systems. Radio frequency identification devices, RFIDs, those are small chips using radio transmission tracking inventory, and it makes tracking inventory quicker and more accurate than with barcodes. Because you don't have to go scan each barcode, you're able to gather that data faster than actually having to scan. So radio frequency identification devices, there are active RFIDs, there are passive, and the active RFIDs have their own power supplies. And the passive RFID tags are inexpensive and small, and they don't need a power source. The goal is to help reduce lost sales from stockouts. And so if you notice sometimes clothing places will do this, or lots of other places, they'll put an RFID tag, and it's inexpensive. They're able to put the little tag in there, and that way they're able to check the stock of how much they have without actually having to go count each item. So let's talk about independent industry marketplaces. The first vertical portals were trading exchanges focused in a particular industry. Now there are different types of marketplaces. There's industry marketplaces, which focus on a single industry. There's independent exchanges that are not controlled by established buyer or seller in the industry. And then there are public markets, which are open to new buyers and sellers just entering the industry. In the mid-2000s, more than 2,200 independent exchanges existed. Today, there are fewer than 100 industry marketplaces still open due to lack of profitability. With the use of internet technologies, we are able to find the most efficient ways, and that's part of business, is some of the parts of that previously worked, when they're no longer profitable for everyone involved in the process, they'll go ahead and shut those down and move on to what works best. So now there are various forms in the business-to-business marketplace. There's lots of different models that are gradually replacing those independent marketplaces. In 2012, Amazon.com launched Amazon Supply, and that is now a part of the Amazon Business Marketplace. Because, as I previously mentioned in another lecture, Amazon has their fingers in everything. So Amazon not only wants to be selling to consumers, they want to make sure that they're finding the most efficient ways to do business-to-business transactions, and for them that was to create Amazon Supply, which is most efficient for them and has been helping other businesses as well. There are also private stores and customer portals as well. So large established sellers feared industry marketplaces would dilute their negotiating power. And so many had already invested heavily in websites, and they believed it would meet customer needs better. So these are password protected private stores for major customers with price reductions on some products. Customer portal site offers private stores along with other services that would be needlessly duplicated if sellers participated in the industry marketplace. There are also private company marketplaces. Large companies purchasing from relatively small vendors exert power in purchasing negotiations. E-procurement software allows companies to manage purchasing functions through web interfaces, It automates authorizations, other steps, and usually includes marketplace functions. When industry marketplaces open for business, these large companies reluctant to abandon their e-procurement software investment. If they would force suppliers to deal with them on their terms rather than negotiate with the industry marketplace, because large firms are usually able to make those demands. Private company marketplace is a marketplace providing auctions, requests for quote postings, and other features similar to those of e-procurement software. Many have expanded to include functions allowing supply chain participants to manage multiple functions. Manufacturing, Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers, distribution centers, transportation orders, invoicing, and payments. Its expanded arrangements are called private industrial networks or private trading exchanges. Industry consortia-sponsored marketplaces are when companies have strong negotiation positions but not enough power to force suppliers to deal with them through private company marketplaces. And so industry consortia-sponsored marketplace is a marketplace formed by several large buyers in a key particular industry. If you look at figure 5-13 on page 247, you'll see a chart that shows a little bit of information about how those different types that we've talked about, private stores, customer portals, independent industry marketplaces, consortia-sponsored marketplaces, and private company marketplaces, you'll see a spectrum of how those vary by buyer-controlled and seller-controlled, and what that looks like for pricing, how many sellers, buyers, etc. And that chart is a good representation to help you remember like how that works on a spectrum. So with all of this information, you might be asking yourself, what's the big takeaway of this? What's the main points of B2B e-commerce? And so the biggest point of it is to create the ultimate consumer orientation in the supply chain. And the biggest point of it is to simplify transactions so that you're able to provide customers what they need or what they want. So the main goal of supply chain management is to help each company focus on meeting the needs of the consumer that is at the end of the supply chain. And so if you look at it that way, that businesses need to complete these transactions and they need to complete these different steps and arrangements and relationships with other companies, they need to complete all of these B2B activities so that they can meet the needs of the consumer who is at the end of the supply chain. And so it's very, very important for companies to build and maintain trust within the supply chain. So a major issue in forming supply chain alliances is developing trust. Key elements are continual communication and information sharing. Internet and the web provide excellent ways to communicate and share information and offer new avenues for building trust. And so these are things to remember from the business side as well as sometimes from the consumer side, but mostly from the business side, is businesses need to create these relationships with each other. And a business relationship doesn't necessarily mean golfing and schmoozing as much as it means fulfilling commitments, communicating well with other businesses, and holding up your end of the deal, and creating those relationships that are going to be beneficial for every party involved. And so that is the biggest takeaway from B2B activities. And so if you have any more questions about anything that you read in Chapter 5 of Electronic Commerce, let me know and I will answer those questions as quickly as possible. I hope that this lecture has helped clarify some of the information throughout the chapter.